Hi friends! Today we are doing Unit 1, Lesson 2, The Riverbank Part 2. Before we start reading, we're going to go over our vocabulary for today's reading. Our first word is arranged, which means ordered or organized specifically. Our second word is dejected, which means depressed, unhappy, sometimes because one feels lonely or left out. Our third word is escorted, which means to be led or accompanied. Our next word is seized, which means grabbed or took hold of suddenly. Our last word is stability, which means the condition of being firm or not likely to move or change. Now let's move into our reading. Leaving the main stream, they now passed into what seemed like a little landlocked lake. Green grass sloped down to either edge. Brown, snaky tree roots gleamed below the surface of the quiet water. Ahead of them could be heard the foamy tumble of a weir with a restless, dripping mill wheel attached to a mill house. The scene was so beautiful that the mole could only hold up both forepaws and gasp, "Oh my!" The rat brought the boat alongside the bank and tied it up. Then he helped the still awkward mole safely ashore and swung out the luncheon basket. The mole asked to be allowed to unpack it all by himself. The rat was very pleased to indulge him. Mole excitedly shook out the tablecloth and spread it. Then one by one, he took out the mysterious packets and carefully arranged them, still gasping, "Oh my, oh my!" When all was ready, the rat said, "Eat up, old fellow." And the mole, who had started his spring cleaning at a very early hour and had not eaten since then, eagerly set to work. "What are you looking at?" said the rat, presently, when the edge of their hunger was somewhat dulled, and the mole's eyes were able to wander off the tablecloth. "I am looking," said Mole, "at a streak of bubbles that I see traveling along the surface of the water." "Bubbles? Oh!" said the rat cheerily. A broad, glistening muzzle showed itself above the edge of the bank, and the otter hauled himself out and shook the water from his coat. "Greedy beggars," he observed. "Why didn't you invite me, Ratty?" "This was a spontaneous affair," explained the rat. "By the way, meet my friend Mr. Mole." "Proud, I'm sure," said the otter, and the two animals were friends forthwith. "Such a rumpus everywhere," continued the otter. "The entire world seems to be out on the river today. I came up this backwater to try to get a moment's peace, and then stumbled upon you fellows." At that moment there was a rustling sound behind them. It seemed to come from a hedge wherein last year's leaves still clung. Seconds later, a stripy head with high shoulders peered out from within. "Come on, old badger," shouted the rat. The badger trotted forward, then grunted, "Company," and turned his back and disappeared from view. "That's just the sort of fellow he is," observed the disappointed rat. "Simply hates society. Now we shan't see any more of him today. Well, tell us, who's out on the river?" "Toad's out for one," replied the otter, in his brand new wagger boat, new togs, new everything. The two animals looked at each other and laughed. "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the rat. "Then he tired of that and took to punting. Nothing would please him but to punt all day. Last year it was houseboating, and we all had to go stay with him in his houseboat and pretend we liked it. It's all the same. Whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts on something fresh. Such a good fellow, too," remarked the otter reflectively, "but no stability, especially in a boat." From where they sat, they could get a glimpse of the main stream across the island that separated them, and just then a wagger boat flashed into view. The rower was a short, stout figure who was splashing badly and rolling a good deal, but working his hardest. The rat stood up and hailed him. However, Toad, for it was he, shook his head and concentrated on the task at hand. "He'll be out of the boat in a minute, if he rolls like that," said the rat. "Of course he will," chuckled the otter. "Did I ever tell you that good story about Toad and the lock keeper?" "The story happened this way," Otter continued. At that moment a mayfly swerved unsteadily on the gentle spring breeze toward Otter. There was a swirl of water and a cloop, and the mayfly was visible no more. Neither was the otter. The mole looked down. The voice was still in his ears, but the grass whereon he had sprawled was clearly vacant. Not an otter to be seen. But again there was a streak of bubbles on the surface of the river. The rat hummed a tune, and the mole remembered that it was considered rude to make any sort of comment about the sudden disappearance of one's friends. "Well, well," said the rat, "I suppose we ought to be moving. I wonder which one of us should pack the luncheon basket." He did not sound overly eager to do it himself. "Oh, please let me," said the mole. So of course the rat let him. The afternoon sun was getting low as the rat sculled gently homewards. The mole was very full of lunch and self-satisfaction, and already quite at home in a boat, or so he thought. He was, however, getting a bit restless, and presently he said, "Ratty, please, I want to row now." The rat shook his head with a smile. "Not yet, my young friend," he said. "Wait till you've had a few lessons." The mole was quiet for a minute or two, but he began to feel more and more jealous of Rat. Suddenly he jumped up and seized the sculls from him. Rat, who had been gazing out over the water, was taken by surprise. He fell backwards off his seat. The triumphant mole took his place and grabbed the sculls with much confidence. "Stop it, you silly!" cried the rat from the bottom of the boat. "You'll have us over." The mole flung his sculls back with a flourish and made a great dig at the water. He missed the surface altogether. His legs flew above his head, and he found himself lying on top of the rat. Greatly alarmed, he made a grab at the side of the boat, and the next moment, sploosh! Over went the boat, and the mole found himself struggling in the river. Oh my, how cold the water was, and oh, how very wet it felt, how it sang in his ears as he went down, down, down! How bright and welcome the sun looked as he rose to the surface, coughing and spluttering! How black was his despair when he felt himself sinking again, that a firm paw gripped him by the back of his neck. It was the rat, and he was laughing. The rat got a hold of a scull and shoved it under Mole's arm. Then he did the same by the other side of him, and swinging behind, propelled the helpless animal to shore. When the rat had rubbed him down and wrung some of the wet out of him, he said, "Now then, old fellow, trot up and down till you're warm and dry again, while I dive for the luncheon basket." So the dismissal mole, wet without and ashamed within, trotted about till he was fairly dry, while the rat plunged into the water again. He recovered the boat, fetched his floating property, and finally dived successfully for the luncheon basket. When all was ready to begin again, the mole, limp and dejected, took his seat in the stern of the boat, and as they set off, he said in a low voice, "Ratty, my generous friend, I'm very sorry indeed for my foolish behavior. My heart quite fails me when I think how I might have lost that beautiful luncheon basket. I have been a fool. Will you ever forgive me?" "That's all right. Bless you," responded the rat cheerily. "What's a little wet to a water rat? I'm more in the water than out of it most days. Don't you think any more about it, and look here. I really think you had better come and stop with me for a little time. My home is very plain and rough, but I am sure I can make you comfortable, and I'll teach you to row and to swim." The mole was so touched by his kindness that he had to brush away a tear, but the rat kindly looked in another direction, and before long the mole's spirits revived again. When they get home, the rat made a bright fire in the parlor. He planted the mole in an armchair in front of it. He fetched down a dressing gown and slippers for him, and told him river stories till supper time. Supper was a most cheerful meal. Shortly afterwards, a sleepy mole had to be escorted upstairs by his host to the bedroom. There he laid his head on his pillow in great peace and contentment. This was just the beginning of their friendship and time together on the river. You may now move on to Unit 1, Lesson 2, Google Form.